The cold did not simply freeze the flesh, it hunted the soul, carving away everything until only the raw, bleeding will to survive remained. Clara Vance dragged her boots through the waist-deep drifts of the Colorado Rockies, a solitary dark speck swallowed by a howling white purgatory. It was the winter of 1878, a season born of pure malice, and the sky above was a heavy, churning vault of gray that offered neither mercy nor direction. The wind tore through the canyons with the shrieks of 1,000 dying men, throwing shards of ice that cut into her exposed skin like broken glass. She was 22 years old, raised on the rugged plains where endurance was the first lesson a child learned. But this storm was not a natural occurrence. It felt like a judgment. Yet the wrath of the heavens paled against the cruelty of men. Clara was not merely lost in the blizzard. She was hunted. 2 nights ago, the world she knew had been reduced to ash and butchery. Silas Thorne. The name was a venom in her mind. Thorne was a man who built empires on the broken backs of pioneers, a railroad baron whose greed stretched across the territory like a black iron web. He had wanted the Vance family valley, a fertile stretch of land that sat perfectly in the path of his proposed northern expansion. When her father, a stubborn veteran of the Mexican-American War, refused to sell their legacy for a fistful of blood money, Thorne did not negotiate. He sent his hounds in the dead of night. Clara's mind violently threw her back to the smell of burning pine and hot copper. She remembered the blinding flashes of rifle fire illuminating the snow, the heavy thud of her father falling against the kitchen table, his chest torn open. She remembered her mother screaming, a sound abruptly silenced by the swing of a rifle butt. Clara had survived only because her father had thrust her into the root cellar, shoving a bundle of heavy parchment into her hands before slamming the heavy oak trapdoor shut. Those papers, the property deeds to the valley, now rested inside her wool coat, pressed tightly against her ribs. They were stiff with the blood of her father. As long as she held them, Thorne could not legally claim the land. The territorial governor in Denver would require proof of purchase or legitimate transfer. Thorne needed her dead, and he needed those papers reduced to cinders. If Thorne's mercenaries, men with hollow eyes and trigger fingers stained with innocent blood, caught her before she reached the federal marshal in the capital, her family's slaughter would be recorded as an unfortunate accident of the frontier, a tragic fire in the wilderness. Her mare, a sturdy roan named Copper, had given her everything. The brave animal had plowed through chest-high snowdrifts for 2 days, fueled by a desperation that mirrored her rider's. But a horse, no matter how strong, possesses a limit against the unnatural fury of a mountain blizzard. An hour past noon, the wind had shifted, plunging the temperature to a level that crystallized the moisture in Clara's lungs. Copper had slowed to a torturous crawl, her flanks heaving, her breath freezing into thick white icicles around her muzzle. Finally, with a low, heart-wrenching groan, the horse's knees buckled. Copper collapsed into the snow, a massive heap of exhausted muscle and failing warmth. Clara had fallen beside her, tearing off her thick leather gloves to stroke the animal's neck. She begged the horse to rise, her voice swallowed instantly by the roaring gale, but the spark of life was already fading from Copper's dark eyes. Clara wept, the tears searing her face before freezing into jagged tracks of ice. Leaving the horse felt like severing a limb, but staying meant dying beside a loyal friend. She took her Winchester rifle, a box of cartridges, and a meager satchel of dried meat, and forced herself to stand. She walked away without looking back, stepping into the absolute void. For hours, she walked. Time lost its meaning. There was only the agonizing lifting of one leg, pushing it forward through the heavy, wet powder, and dragging the other to follow. Her boots were solid blocks of ice. She could no longer feel her toes, and a dull, throbbing agony had settled deep into her shins. The physical pain was profound, a constant, screaming reminder of her mortality. But soon, the pain began to change. The sharp, biting agony dulling into a heavy, intoxicating numbness. This was the true danger of the White Death. It stopped breaking down the door and began whispering invitations instead. A strange, suffocating warmth began to spread from her core, radiating outward to her frozen limbs. Her mind, fractured by grief and the relentless cold, began to play tricks on her. The dark shapes of the towering pines morphed into men standing in the snow, waiting for her. She heard her mother's voice, clear and sweet, calling her for supper over the roar of the wind. She saw the warm glow of their hearth fire dancing in the snowdrifts ahead. She stumbled, her knees hitting the hard-packed ice beneath the fresh powder. It would be so easy to close her eyes, just for a moment, to rest in the deceptive warmth and let the storm bury her, burying Thorne's ambitions and the painful memories of the slaughter along with her. Who would know? The mountains kept their secrets well. Would her bones become just another forgotten piece of the landscape, discovered by scavengers in the spring thaw? She shook her head violently, slapping her own cheeks with her stiff, useless hands. She had to climb. She had reached the base of Blackwood Ridge. The locals in the valley below never spoke of the ridge without crossing themselves or spitting on the dirt. It was a treacherous, jagged spine of dark granite that pierced the clouds, a place notorious for sudden avalanches and impassable ravines. They whispered stories of a shadow that stalked the crags, a beast of unnatural size and temperament that preyed on lost trappers and reckless miners. But Clara feared the monsters in tailored suits down in the valley far more than any mountain folklore. She forced herself up the incline. Every step was a battle against gravity and the storm. The wind here was ferocious, threatening to tear her from the mountainside and cast her into the abyssal canyons below. Her lungs burned with every shallow intake of the razor-sharp air. Then, a flicker. Clara stopped, blinking through the crust of ice on her eyelashes. High above, clinging to the side of a massive granite outcropping, was a pinprick of light. It was amber, warm, and steady. Not a reflection of the moon, which was entirely obscured by the storm, but the distinct, unmistakable glow of a lantern or a hearth fire spilling through a window. It defied reason. No prospector, no trapper, no sane human being lived this high on Blackwood Ridge. It was an environment hostile to life itself. But desperation makes no room for logic. That light meant heat. It meant survival. She abandoned the rifle. It was too heavy, a burden her failing muscles could no longer bear. She crawled. She dug her fingers into the snow, clawing her way up the steep incline, pulling her dead weight inch by agonizing inch. The blizzard fought her with renewed fury, throwing blinding sheets of white across her path, trying to erase the light from her vision. The terrain leveled out. The snow beneath her hands gave way to the solid, unyielding surface of rough-hewn timber. It was a porch. Clara dragged her torso over the edge, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Before her stood a cabin, but calling it such was a disservice. It was a fortress of heavy, dark logs, reinforced with thick iron bands and built directly into the side of the mountain. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker designed to withstand a siege. She reached the massive oak door. There was no knocker. Her hands were blackened and curled inward, useless claws incapable of grasping a handle. With the absolute last reserve of her strength, Clara threw her upper body forward, her shoulders striking the thick wood with a heavy, dull impact. She hit it again and again, a desperate, rhythmic pounding against the timber. Her legs gave out completely. She slumped against the base of the door, her cheek resting on the freezing iron plating. The warmth from the cabin seemed to seep through the wood, a tantalizing promise of salvation just inches away. The wind died down for a fraction of a second, an eerie, heavy silence settling over the mountain. From inside the cabin, a sound cut through the quiet, the slow, heavy scrape of a massive iron bolt sliding back. The heavy door swung inward on rusted hinges, groaning under its own immense weight. A wave of glorious, intense heat rolled over Clara, carrying the heavy scent of cured tobacco, wood smoke, and roasting meat. It was the smell of life. She tried to speak, to beg for sanctuary, but her throat was locked, her vocal cords frozen. She managed only a weak, breathless rattle. Clara tilted her head up, fighting the blackness that was rapidly closing in on the edges of her vision. She did not look at the roaring fire in the massive stone hearth. She looked at the silhouette filling the doorway. It blotted out the light entirely. The figure was gigantic, a towering mountain of heavy furs and thick, corded muscle. It stood too broad, too imposing to be an ordinary man. A thick, ragged breath hitched in the creature's chest, a sound like a heavy bellows working a forge. Clara stared into the darkness of the figure's face, her mind reeling in absolute terror. As her eyes rolled back and the merciful darkness of unconsciousness finally claimed her, a singular, terrifying realization anchored her to the floorboards. She had survived the freezing purgatory of the mountain only to deliver herself directly to the beast. Awakening is rarely a gentle climb from the dark, but for Clara, it felt like being dragged over a bed of hot coals. Her first breath was a ragged gasp of pine smoke and pure, unadulterated agony. The intense heat of a roaring hearth fire washed over her face, pulling her violently from the numb void of the blizzard. She was lying on a thick bed of furs, her frozen, sodden outer coat and boots having been removed. The agonizing pain blooming in her hands and feet was a terrifying, beautiful sensation. It meant the blood was fighting its way back into deadened veins. It felt as though 1,000 hot needles were being driven under her fingernails. She bit her cracked lip to keep from screaming, her eyes darting wildly around the unfamiliar surroundings. The cabin was a fortress. The walls were constructed of massive, unhewn pine logs, stripped of bark and sealed with hardened pitch. Heavy iron brackets reinforced the corners. It was a dwelling built to wage war against the mountain itself. But Clara's gaze did not linger on the architecture. It locked onto the shadowy corner across the room, where the enormous silhouette from the doorway was methodically feeding split logs into the fire. He turned, and the dancing amber light caught his features. Clara's breath seized in her throat, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The townsfolk of Prosperity had whispered tales of the beast of Blackwood Ridge, using the legend to frighten disobedient children and explain away missing livestock. Looking at the man before her, Clara realized the campfire stories had been severely lacking in imagination. He was a mountain of a man, clad in thick patched layers of wolf and grizzly hide that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. But it was his face that anchored Clara in a state of primal dread. The left side was rugged, weathered tight by the harsh mountain sun, framed by a thick, dark beard. The right side was a canvas of pure devastation. Thick, roping burn scars crept up his neck, pulling the flesh of his jaw and cheek into a permanent, melted snarl. The skin was violently discolored, a knotted topography of trauma that had consumed his right ear and dragged the corner of his eye downward. He looked like a man who had walked halfway through the gates of hell and decided to turn back. Clara scrambled backward, her raw heels scraping against the rough floorboards until her spine hit the solid logs of the wall. She instinctively clutched her chest. Through the fabric of her woolen shirt, she felt the stiff edge of the property deed still safely tucked against her skin. He had stripped her of her frozen coat to save her life, but he had not searched her. The sudden movement drew his attention. The man's gaze, one eye pale blue and the other a milky, ruined marble, fixed upon her. Clara braced herself for the violence she'd come to expect from the world. She had fled the polished, smiling butchery of Silas Thorne, only to become trapped in a cage with a monster of the high peaks. She pressed her eyes shut, waiting for the heavy strike, the crushing grip of the beast. Instead, she heard a sound that defied her expectations. It was a heavy, irregular footfall, a solid thud followed by a scraping drag. He was moving toward her, but his gait was severely crippled. Clara opened her eyes as the massive figure knelt beside her. The scent of him was overwhelming. Wood smoke, animal fat, and something sharp and medicinal. He did not utter a single syllable. He reached out with hands that could easily crush her skull. Clara flinched, turning her head away, her muscles trembling uncontrollably. Those terrifying, massive hands took hold of her frostbitten right hand. The touch was startlingly gentle. There was no hesitation, no brutal clumsiness. He examined the blackened, swollen flesh of her fingers with an intense, clinical focus. Reaching into a leather satchel at his side, he produced a small clay jar. He scooped out a generous portion of a pungent, dark green salve and began to massage it into her damaged skin. Clara watched in stunned silence. The monster's touch was cool and immensely relieving. The agonizing burn of the thawing flesh immediately began to dull under the application of the ointment. He worked with a deliberate, practiced rhythm, his thumbs moving over her knuckles with the deftness of a jeweler handling precious stones. Once the salve was applied, he produced a roll of clean, boiled linen and bound her hands with crisp, efficient movements. The wrapping was perfectly tensioned, tight enough to protect the flesh, but loose enough to allow the returning circulation. It was the work of a healer, not a savage. He repeated the process on her frozen feet, his face an unreadable mask of ruined flesh and quiet concentration. The sheer contradiction of his appearance and his actions paralyzed Clara's mind. Every instinct screamed at her to fear him. Yet the undeniable reality was that he was tending to her wounds with an expertise she had never witnessed, even from the expensive physician down in Prosperity. When he finished, he rose with a heavy grunt, his bad leg protesting the movement. He limped back to the hearth, hooking a heavy iron kettle over the flames. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the furious shrieking of the blizzard outside. The wind battered the heavy timber walls, a relentless assault that made the entire cabin groan. Yet, inside, the warmth was absolute. He returned a few moments later, holding out a battered tin cup. Steam curled from the rim, carrying the rich, savory aroma of venison bone broth. Clara hesitated, looking from the scarred ruin of his face to the offering in his massive, rough hand. Her stomach cramped violently, a sharp reminder of how long she had gone without sustenance. Slowly, with trembling, bandaged hands, she reached out and took the cup. Her fingers brushed against his thick, calloused skin. He did not pull away, nor did he linger. He simply released the cup, nodded once, and retreated to a heavy wooden chair in the darkest corner of the cabin, leaving her in the warm circle of the firelight. Clara drank the broth. It was rich, heavily salted, and coated her raw throat like liquid velvet. With every swallow, the crippling chill retreated further from her bones. She pulled the heavy bear pelt up to her chin, watching the silent giant across the room. He sat perfectly still, a shadow among shadows, his good eye staring into the dancing flames of the hearth. The prejudice of the valley below had painted him as a soulless fiend, a predator of the high ridges. Yet, here she sat, warm, fed, and meticulously bandaged by the very hands she had feared would tear her apart. The monster had not claimed her life. He had preserved it with a delicate precision that baffled her. She rested her head against the wall, the exhaustion finally pulling her under. The storm outside continued to rage, blanketing the mountain in impenetrable white. She was safe for the night, hidden from Thorn and his murderous riders. But the blizzard would not last forever. When the skies cleared, the tracks of her dead horse would lead the wolves directly to the base of this ridge. She wondered what the silent giant would do when he discovered the immense danger she had brought to his doorstep, and where a monster of the mountains had learned to bind wounds with the hands of a surgeon. For 48 hours, the only voices inside the timber fortress belonged to the shrieking wind and the crackle of the hearth. Then, the monster finally broke the silence, and he sounded like a scholar. The blizzard had raged with unyielding fury, a white leviathan swallowing the peaks, trapping Clara and her terrifying host in a suffocating proximity. During those 2 days, the swelling in her hands and feet had subsided under his meticulous care. She watched him from her bed of furs. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic drag, a testament to a shattered leg. performing his daily chores with a quiet, profound dignity. He chopped wood, tended a simmering stew of elk meat and root vegetables, and changed her linen bandages with the same clinical, feather-light touch. He was a creature of routine, entirely detached from the savage rumors that haunted the valley below. On the evening of the second day, Clara sat up, clutching the heavy bear pelt around her shoulders. She watched him grind dried willow bark in a stone mortar. The firelight danced across the ruined landscape of his right cheek, turning the thick burn scars into a map of molten copper. "Why do you hide up here?" Clara asked, her voice rasping from the dry mountain air. He stopped grinding. The mortar and pestle rested still in his massive hands. He did not turn around immediately. When he finally spoke, the sound vibrated through the floorboards. Rich, deep, and impossibly articulate. "Men fear what they cannot understand," he said, his tone carrying the precise diction of a university lecture hall. "And they destroy what they fear. The mountain asks no questions. It only demands respect." Clara stared, her mind struggling to reconcile the horrific visage of the beast with the eloquent, sorrowful voice of the man. "You are not a savage," she whispered, a statement of sudden, absolute certainty. "You bound my hands like a physician." He turned, the milky ruin of his blind eye catching the firelight. "I was a surgeon once, Major Elias." "Army of the Potomac?" Clara flinched, not at his appearance, but at the stark tragedy hanging in the air. He was a man of science, a healer of the Republic, reduced to a terrifying myth by the cruelty of circumstance. Elias limped heavily to the wooden table, pouring boiling water over the ground willow bark to steep a bitter tea for her pain. "Petersburg," Elias continued, his gaze distant, piercing through the timber walls into a past drenched in blood. The trench lines were a slaughterhouse. We operated in mud and filth for 3 days straight without sleep. Then, the Confederate artillery found our field hospital. He touched his ruined cheek, a phantom caress over the melted flesh. A shell decimated the surgical tent. It took half my face and shattered my femur. But the fire was the true horror. The canvas went up in seconds. I lay pinned beneath a burning support beam, screaming for my commanding officer to order a rescue. Elias brought the tin cup of willow tea to her bedside, his good eye hardening into a chip of blue ice. He was a captain of logistics, a man who valued supply wagons over bleeding soldiers. He looked me directly in the eye, gave the order to abandon the wounded, and rode away with the medicinal stores to secure his own promotion. "He left us to burn." Clara took the cup, her hands shaking slightly. "You survived." "I was dragged out by a dying corporal," Elias said, returning to his chair in the shadows. "I spent a year in a military ward in Washington, enduring agonies I would not wish upon a rabid dog. When they finally discharged me, I found a society that cheered the uniform but retched at the man wearing it. Women crossed the street to avoid my shadow. Employers refused to hire a monster to treat their ailments. So, I walked west until the roads disappeared, seeking a place where my face would offend nothing but the pine trees." Clara lowered the cup. The broth she had consumed earlier suddenly felt heavy in her stomach. A cold dread began to uncoil in her chest, a premonition born of the dark, interconnected roots of human greed. "This captain?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What was his name?" Elias closed his eyes, the muscles in his jaw ticking. "Silas Thorne." The name dropped into the quiet cabin like a lead weight. Clara gasped, a sharp intake of air that burned her healing lungs. The sheer, impossible scale of Thorne's malice stretched across the continent, ruining lives in the bloody mud of Virginia and the freezing snows of Colorado. She threw off the bear pelt, ignoring the sharp protest of her healing feet. She unbuttoned the top of her woolen shirt, reaching into the makeshift pocket against her ribs. She pulled out the folded, stiff parchment. The edges were stained a dark, rusted brown. She held it out to Elias. Elias leaned forward, his singular blue eye narrowing as he recognized the thick legal paper and the undeniable stain of dried blood. He stood, his heavy limp pronouncing his every step, and took the documents from her trembling hands. He unfolded them near the firelight, his eyes scanning the elegant script of the Territorial Land Office. "These are the deeds to my family's valley," Clara said, her voice trembling with a fresh wave of grief. "My father refused to sell to him. Thorne wants the land for his railroad expansion. 2 nights ago, he sent his riders. They butchered my father and my mother in our kitchen. I only escaped because my father hid me in the cellar with these papers. Thorne's empire is built on blood. Elias, your blood and my family's." Elias stared at the papers, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges. The man who had abandoned him to a fiery death was now the architect of the slaughter in the valley below. Decades had passed, yet the monster remained the same, trading a military uniform for a tailored suit, trading wartime cowardice for corporate butchery. He carefully folded the deeds and handed them back to Clara. He did not offer empty platitudes or hollow words of comfort. He understood the absolute, unyielding nature of her pain because it mirrored his own. A profound, heavy silence settled over them once more, but the nature of it had shifted. It was no longer the tense, terrifying quiet of captor and prey. It was the solemn, unbreakable bond of 2 ghosts haunting the same graveyard. Elias turned his gaze to the single, thick glass window of the cabin. The howling wind that had battered the timber for 2 days was beginning to lose its pitch. The violent shrieks were fading into a low, mournful moan. The ice plastered against the glass was thinning, revealing a sliver of pale, gray light. The white death was retreating. The blizzard would break by morning. Clara knew the moment the snow stopped falling, Thorne's trackers would find the frozen carcass of her horse. They would see the mountain towering above, and they would come hunting for the prize she carried. She looked at Elias, an aging, crippled surgeon who had fought a war against his own memories for over a decade. He had saved her life, but he owed her nothing more. If the wolves of prosperity ascended Blackwood Ridge, she had no idea if the scarred hermit would stand aside, or if the buried fury of Major Elias would finally ignite to settle a debt paid in ash and bone. The silence of a broken mountain storm is a liar, promising peace when it merely clears the stage for a slaughter. Dawn broke over the Colorado Rockies not with warmth, but with a blinding, diamond-hard cruelty. Sunlight pierced the single thick glass pane of the cabin, casting long, stark shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. The wind had exhausted its fury during the night, leaving behind an ocean of pristine, treacherous white that blanketed the jagged peaks. Clara stood by the window, her breath fogging the frozen glass, looking down the dizzying drop toward the valley below. The world outside was a masterpiece of terrifying beauty and utter lethality. Every pine branch was laden with heavy snow, and the air was so sharp and frigid it seemed to crackle against the glass. Behind her, Elias was not admiring the sunrise. He was a man of war, and the rhythm of conflict was deeply ingrained in his scarred bones. He sat at the heavy oak table, meticulously oiling the lever action of a battered, heavy-barrel Sharps rifle. Beside the weapon lay a heavy hunting knife with a blade as long as a man's forearm, the steel gleaming dully in the morning light. A bandolier of thick, brass-cased cartridges rested over his chair. He moved with a grim, deliberate purpose, a terrifying calm settling over his disfigured features. He knew the absolute certainty of the frontier. The tracks of Clara's dead mare would serve as a morbid, unavoidable signpost for Thorne's hunting party. Down at the timberline, a grueling mile below the ridge, 5 riders sat atop exhausted, lathered horses, their breath pluming violently in the freezing air. They wore heavy canvas dusters over thick wool coats, their face half covered by dark woolen scarves. Their leader, a scarred, hollow-eyed killer named Carver, stared at the frozen, snow-dusted mound that used to be a brave roan mare. He spurred his horse forward, his dark eyes scanning the deep, staggering indentations in the powder leading upward. The tracks were faint, nearly filled in by the tail end of the blizzard, but they pointed directly toward the jagged, forbidding spine of Blackwood Ridge. Carver signaled his men to dismount. Horses would be useless on that sheer incline. They drew their lever-action repeaters, jacking shells into the chambers, and began the agonizing ascent, driven upward by the heavy weight of Thorne's gold. Inside the cabin, Elias stood up, his bad leg protesting the sudden weight. He strapped on a pair of wide, woven snowshoes, securing the thick leather bindings over his heavy boots with practiced efficiency. He threw a massive white bearskin over his broad shoulders, effectively turning himself into a ghost against the snowscape. He looked at Clara, his singular blue eye locking onto hers with an intense, unyielding gravity. He instructed her to drop the heavy iron bolt on the oak door the moment he stepped outside and to stay entirely away from the window. Then, he stepped out into the biting cold, his massive form dissolving instantly into the blinding glare of the mountain morning. Elias did not intend to let the mercenaries reach the flat expanse outside his cabin. He knew every treacherous contour, every hidden death trap of Blackwood Ridge. He knew exactly where the snow laid heavy and deceptive over hidden ravines, and where the deadfall timber hung precariously from the rocky overhangs above the trail. He moved with a surprising, terrifying speed. His heavy limp was largely compensated by the wide snowshoes and a decade of harsh, unforgiving adaptation. He reached a narrow, winding chute flanked by sheer granite walls. It was the only viable path up to the peak. Here, Elias prepared his welcome. He did not require explosives or elaborate machinery. He used the lethal, unfeeling mechanics of the wilderness. Working swiftly, he leveraged a massive, dead pine trunk precariously over the lip of the chute, securing it with a tensioned hemp rope hidden perfectly beneath a layer of fresh powder. A few yards down the trail, he covered a deep, jagged fissure in the rock with a fragile lattice of frozen branches, dusting it with snow to match the surrounding, solid ground flawlessly. Then he climbed higher, vanishing into the crags, and waited. An hour later, the first of Thorne's men breached the lower section of the chute. They were sweating profusely beneath their heavy coats, despite the freezing temperature, their chests heaving, their eyes squinting against the blinding white terrain. Carver led the pack, his rifle held tight against his shoulder, his finger hovering over the trigger. The air was dead silent, broken only by the heavy, crunching rhythm of their boots plunging into the snow. The second man in line stepped exactly where the surgeon had anticipated. The frozen branches snapped with the sharp, violent crack of dry bones. The mercenary dropped instantly, swallowed by the earth with a truncated, panicked scream. He plummeted 20 feet, his body impacting the jagged granite rocks at the bottom of the crevasse with a sickening, heavy finality. The remaining 4 men froze in absolute, paralyzing panic. Carver shouted frantic orders, his voice cracking thinly in the high-altitude air, demanding his men fan out and press their backs against the rock walls. But Elias was already moving. He stood on the ridge directly above them, a massive, white-clad phantom materializing from the swirling snowdrifts. He did not raise his rifle to fire. Instead, with a single, powerful swing of his heavy hunting knife, he severed the tensioned rope holding back the deadfall. The massive pine trunk dislodged with a deep groan, tumbling down the steep embankment with terrifying, accelerating momentum. It gathered speed, sweeping up a localized avalanche of heavy snow and jagged ice. The mercenaries looked up just as the timber violently struck the narrow chute. The sheer, crushing force of the impact swept 2 men entirely off their feet, carrying them screaming over the unguarded edge of the cliff to the abyssal canyons far below. Their shrieks faded quickly into the vast, uncaring emptiness of the mountain. Carver and the last remaining mercenary scrambled backward, firing their rifles blindly up the ridge. The heavy lead bullets chipped harmlessly against the granite outcroppings. Elias had vanished again, moving laterally along the cliff face with the silent grace of an apex predator. The surviving mercenary backed against a rock wall, His hands shaking so violently, he dropped his extra brass cartridges into the deep snow. A shadow detached itself from the crevice right beside him. Elias moved with brutal, surgical efficiency. He did not use the blade. The heavy brass butt plate of the Sharp's rifle connected squarely with the side of the mercenary's head, dropping the man instantly and silently into the powder. Carver witnessed the swift, silent violence from a few yards away. He saw the towering figure cloaked in thick bear hide step over the fallen man. He saw the horrific, ruined face staring at him with a milky, dead eye. The burn scars vivid and terrifying against the snow. The campfire stories of prosperity came rushing back, paralyzing the hardened killer with pure, primal terror. The beast of Blackwood Ridge was not a fable told to frighten children. It was an engine of destruction standing right in front of him. Carver fired one wild, desperate shot that tore through the very edge of Elias's bearskin cloak. Then, he turned and bolted down the mountain, abandoning his men, sliding and stumbling over the treacherous terrain in a blind, desperate bid for survival. Elias did not pursue him. He stood in the cold wind, watching Carver's frantic descent until the man was nothing more than a dark speck retreating toward the tree line. He retrieved his snowshoes, slung the heavy rifle over his shoulder, and began the agonizingly steep climb back to his fortress. When Clara heard the rhythmic knock and unbarred the heavy oak door, she saw him standing on the porch. His immense chest was heaving with exertion, and his rough hands were stained with the dark blood of the men who had come to slaughter her. He stepped inside, bringing the sharp, metallic scent of copper and cold ozone into the warmth of the cabin. To anyone else in the territory, the figure before her was a living nightmare. To Clara, standing amidst the fading echoes of gunfire, he was an absolute sanctuary. Elias set the heavy rifle on the table, the metallic clatter harsh in the quiet room. He turned to Clara, his expression a hardened mask of grim certainty. He had successfully repelled the first wave, but he had purposely allowed the leader to live and carry the message back to the valley. The monster was real, and he was fiercely guarding the prize. "They will not climb this ridge again," Elias stated, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to shake the floorboards. "Not with rifles. Thorn will listen to his terrified dog. He will realize the mountain is against him, and he will send a small army with dynamite to blast this entire ridge to dust." He looked around the heavy timber walls of his sanctuary, a place he had meticulously built over a decade of lonely, bitter exile. The fortress had kept the world at bay, but it was about to become an inescapable tomb. Clara stared at the terrifying, capable man before her, instinctively clutching the heavy parchment deeds in her pocket. The elements had failed to kill them, and the mountain's wrath had been temporarily weaponized in their favor. But they were vastly outnumbered and utterly isolated from any semblance of law. How could a crippled, aging surgeon and a young woman recovering from frostbite possibly survive a descent into a valley swarming with heavily armed killers out for their blood? And even if they miraculously reached the bottom of the mountain, what hope did they have of reaching the outside world before Thorn's iron grip crushed them completely? A fortress becomes a tomb the moment its thickest walls stop keeping the enemy out and begin keeping the besieged trapped inside. Elias knew this bitter truth intimately, having learned it in the burning ruins of a Virginia field hospital. And he refused to learn it twice. The mountain had shielded them, but with Carver retreating to the valley to report his horrific failure, the nature of their sanctuary had fundamentally changed. Thorn would not suffer a bruised ego nor risk the exposure of his crimes. He would rally a small army, equip them with blasting powder, and reduce Blackwood Ridge to a field of shattered granite. Elias moved through the cabin with a swift, unsentimental efficiency, abandoning the refuge he had spent a decade carving from the rock. He packed a heavy canvas rucksack with dense strips of dried elk meat, his leather roll of surgical instruments, and heavy, brass-cased cartridges. He approached Clara, tossing a thick, fleece-lined sheepskin coat onto her lap. It was vastly superior to her ruined wool garment, designed to repel the brutal bite of the high-altitude wind. He followed it with a pair of sturdy hide boots, thickly insulated with rabbit fur. "We cannot outrun dynamite," Elias stated, his deep voice slicing through the lingering tension of the morning's violence. "And we cannot wait for the spring thaw. Thorn will buy every rifle from here to Denver to see you buried." Clara laced the boots, the dull ache in her healing toes manageable beneath the thick insulation. The fear that had paralyzed her 2 days ago had been entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, hard anger. "Then we take the fight to him," she said, her voice steady and resolute. Elias nodded, the milky ruin of his blind eye catching the pale light from the window. He detailed a rumor he had traded furs for at the lower trading post months prior. A federal marshal, a man possessing a rare and uncorrupted iron will, was currently touring the territorial capital to investigate allegations of rampant land theft. To summon him, they needed to reach the telegraph office in Prosperity, Thorn's heavily fortified stronghold. They had to walk directly into the viper's nest, using the blood-stained deeds as bait and absolute proof of Thorn's butchery. They stepped out the heavy timber door, leaving it unbarred to the wind. Elias did not look back at the only home he had known since the war. He led the way down the treacherous, wind-scoured spine of Blackwood Ridge. The descent was a brutal, agonizing exercise in controlled falling. The mountain was a chaotic landscape of hidden ice flows, waist-deep powder, and razor-sharp granite outcroppings that threatened to tear their flesh with every misstep. The blinding glare of the afternoon sun threatened to scorch their retinas, forcing them to squint against the pure, unforgiving white canvas of the wilderness. During this grueling descent, the journey transformed their dynamic entirely. Clara was no longer the freezing, helpless victim dragged from the storm, and Elias ceased to be merely her terrifying savior. He became her instructor in the harsh, unforgiving arithmetic of frontier survival. He taught her to read the subtle, sweeping undulations in the snow that betrayed hidden, lethal crevasses. He demonstrated how to walk with a sliding, heavy-heeled gait, forcing her to test the underlying ice before committing her weight to the step. He instructed her to keep the lever action of her Winchester rifle tucked securely beneath her arm, utilizing her body heat to prevent the mechanical parts from freezing solid in the biting air. When they encountered a sheer, 10-foot drop over a frozen, vertical runoff, Elias did not offer to carry her. Instead, he tossed her a length of heavy coiled hemp rope. He verbally guided her through the process of finding proper, weight-bearing anchor points in the frozen stone, forcing her to secure her own descent. She followed his commands with a gritty, unyielding determination. Her muscles screamed in protest, her lungs burned with the thin air, but her spirit solidified into something as dense and impenetrable as the mountain itself. She carried her own weight, moving not behind the monster of the ridge, but beside him. By dusk, the vicious cold returned with a vengeance, sinking its teeth deep into the valley floor. They sought temporary shelter beneath a massive, overhanging shelf of slate, lighting no fire to avoid drawing the eyes of any lingering scouts. They ate the dried meat in absolute silence, wrapped tightly in their heavy furs, their breath pluming white in the gloom. A few miles below, the twinkling, jaundiced lights of Prosperity were clearly visible, spreading like a muddy stain against the pristine snow of the lower basin. Even from this distance, the settlement exuded a foul presence. Plumes of thick, black smoke belched from the silver smelters, choking the stars. The faint, rhythmic thud of the ore-stamping mills echoed up the canyon walls, a mechanical heartbeat of unbridled industry and greed. It was a town built entirely on timber, silver, and the ruthless exploitation of desperate men. It was Thorn's absolute kingdom, a place where the law was dictated by the weight of a coin purse and the speed of a draw. Clara touched the breast of her sheepskin coat, feeling the stiff crinkle of the property deeds beneath her shirt. They were the singular key to dismantling Thorn's sprawling empire, but they were also a guaranteed death warrant if discovered on her corpse before the wire was sent. She glanced at Elias in the gloom. The horrifying burn scars on his face were shrouded in the deep shadows of the rock overhang, leaving only the grim, determined set of his jaw and the quiet, lethal intensity of his posture. He was a man who had already died once, returning from the grave to escort her through a man-made purgatory. The telegraph office sat squarely in the center of prosperity, flanked by sprawling saloons and the heavily guarded territorial bank. Infiltrating the town meant navigating muddy, crowded streets crawling with mercenaries who were actively hunting them. Elias was a towering giant, his disfigured face a legendary horror deeply ingrained in the local populace. Hiding his distinctive silhouette in a frontier settlement would be akin to hiding a grizzly bear in a church parlor. Furthermore, the telegraph operator was undoubtedly on Thorne's extensive payroll, a frightened clerk whose loyalty was bought and kept through the constant threat of violence. Clara checked the loading gate of her Winchester in the dark, the crisp metallic slide of the lever a harsh whisper against the rising wind. Beside her, Elias meticulously spun the heavy cylinder of his Colt revolver, checking each brass cartridge by touch. Tomorrow night, under the cover of a freezing darkness, they would slip into the lawless, violent streets of prosperity. They were vastly outnumbered and walking into a heavily armed trap, relying entirely on a desperate bluff and the incredibly slim hope of a telegraph wire reaching a righteous man hundreds of miles away. As they sat shivering in the freezing dark, staring down at the glowing, corrupted lights of the town, Clara wondered what would happen if the terrified operator refused to transmit their desperate plea, and what violent, unchained fury Major Elias would finally unleash if Thorne's wolves cornered them in those muddy alleys with absolutely nowhere left to run. The town of Prosperity did not sleep. It merely drank until it bled. A festering wound of timber and mud illuminated by the sickly yellow glare of gas lamps. Into this sprawling den of thieves and desperate men, two phantoms descended from the freezing dark of the mountain. The descent had taken the final remnants of the day, swapping the pure, lethal white of the high peaks for an ankle-deep slurry of freezing muck and horse offal. The air here was thick, choked with the acrid stench of coal smoke belching from the silver smelters and the sour reek of spilled rot-gut whiskey. It was a kingdom of vice, tightly gripped in the iron fist of Silas Thorne. Elias moved through the peripheral shadows of the main thoroughfare like a heavily burdened ghost. He was entirely swathed in thick wool and leather. A wide-brimmed Stetson was pulled low over his brow, and a heavy dark scarf was wrapped securely around his lower face, concealing the horrific, melted topography of his scars. Despite his efforts to blend in, his sheer, towering mass and the rhythmic, heavy drag of his crippled leg drew uneasy glances from staggering miners and loitering enforcers. Clara walked a half-step behind him, her head bowed beneath the collar of her sheepskin coat, her gloved hand resting firmly on the cold iron receiver of the Winchester hidden within its folds. They navigated the treacherous, crowded boardwalks until they reached a narrow, garbage-strewn alleyway wedged between a raucous gambling hall and a darkened assayer's office. Across the muddy street stood their objective, the Territorial Telegraph Office. It was a narrow, unpainted, clapboard building, its single window glowing with a weak, flickering lantern light. Elias backed into the absolute darkness of the alley, becoming indistinguishable from the stacked whiskey barrels and discarded crates. He gave Clara a single, curt nod. His massive hands rested on the grips of the Colt revolvers holstered beneath his heavy coat. He would hold the dark, a silent sentinel against the wolves, while she stepped into the light. Clara crossed the street, her boots squelching loudly in the freezing mud. She pushed open the door of the telegraph office. The bell above the frame chimed with a brittle, intrusive cheerfulness. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of ozone, stale coffee, and terrified sweat. Behind a wire mesh counter sat the operator, a painfully thin young man with ink-stained fingers and a heavily pomaded comb-over. He was in the process of locking his cash box, his shoulders jumping at the sound of the bell. He looked up, opening his mouth to declare the office closed, but the words died in his throat. Clara threw back her heavy coat, revealing the lever-action rifle gripped tightly in her hands. She did not aim it at him, but the implication was stark and unavoidable. "I have no money, Miss," the operator stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the front window. "Thorne's men collect the receipts every evening." "I swear it. I am not a thief," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register she had not known she possessed until the mountain had forged it. She stepped closer to the wire mesh, reaching into her inner pocket. She withdrew the folded, blood-stained property deeds and pressed them flat against the counter. "I need you to send a wire to the federal marshal in Denver. Immediately." The operator looked down at the rusted brown stains on the heavy parchment. He recognized the official seal of the Territorial Land Office, and he understood exactly what the blood signified. Prosperity was a town built on buried secrets, and the young man knew full well what happened to those who dug them up. "If Mr. Thorne finds out I transmitted this," the operator whispered, his hands trembling so violently he dropped his keys, "he will have Carver skin me and nail my hide to the smelter doors. You are asking me to commit suicide." "Silas Thorne slaughtered my family 2 nights ago," Clara replied, her tone as cold and unyielding as the granite of Blackwood Ridge. "He butchered an old man and a woman in their kitchen for dirt. If you do not send this wire, their blood is on your hands just as surely as it is on his. The marshal is an honest man. He will bring the federal cavalry." "But he needs to know the slaughter is happening." The young man stared at her, caught between the immediate, terrifying reality of the woman with the rifle and the looming, systematic cruelty of the railroad baron. He looked at the blood on the paper, a physical manifestation of the rumors he had spent years trying to ignore. With a ragged sigh that sounded like a death rattle, he pulled his brass telegraph key forward. "Dictate," he ordered, his voice hollow. Clara spoke clearly, detailing the massacre, the stolen land, and the undeniable proof she carried. The office filled with the rapid, sharp clicking of the brass key, a mechanical heartbeat sending a desperate plea across hundreds of miles of frozen wire. It took less than 2 minutes. The operator tore off the paper confirmation slip and shoved it through the mesh. "It is routed to the capital," he said, collapsing back into his chair, a man utterly defeated by his own momentary courage. "May God have mercy on us all." Clara took the slip, a surge of profound, fierce triumph warming her chest. The silent scream of the valley had finally been given a voice. She turned and stepped back out into the freezing, chaotic street. She looked toward the dark alleyway where Elias waited, prepared to signal their retreat, but the frontier is a master of cruel timing. From the saloon next door, a prospector stumbled out onto the boardwalk. He was heavily intoxicated, singing a slurred, bawdy tune, his heavy canvas coat reeking of spilled whiskey and vomit. He veered off the wooden planks, intending to relieve himself in the shadows between the buildings. He blundered blindly into the alleyway, his heavy boots slipping in the muck, and pitched forward. He collided violently with the towering, hidden form of the surgeon. Elias grunted, stepping back to maintain his balance, his heavy, crippled leg betraying him in the slick mud. The sudden impact knocked his wide-brimmed Stetson into the filth. Worse, the prospector's flailing hands caught the edge of Elias's thick woolen scarf, dragging it down his chest. The sickly yellow illumination from the saloon side window pierced the gloom of the alley, falling directly upon Elias's face. The harsh light through the catastrophic, melted topography of his burn scars into terrifying relief. The mottled, violet and copper-colored flesh, the twisted ruin of his ear, and the dead, milky stare of his blind eye were suddenly exposed to the world. The drunkard froze, his drunken stupor instantly vaporized by a surge of primal, icy terror. His eyes bulged, reflecting the monstrous visage of the local legend made flesh. "The beast!" the prospector shrieked, his voice tearing through the night like a rusted saw blade against bone. "The beast of Blackwood! It's in the town!" The scream acted like a gunshot in a crowded theater. The bawdy piano music inside the saloon abruptly ceased. The muddy thoroughfare, previously filled with the low hum of vice, fell into a sudden, heavily armed silence. Men stopped in their tracks, turning toward the alleyway with hands instinctively dropping to their holstered irons. From the balcony of the territorial bank, a heavily armed sentry peered down, spotting the massive, unmasked figure in the alley. "It's Carver's ghost!" the sentry bellowed. Raising a repeater rifle, "They're here!" "Ring the alarm!" A brass bell began to toll frantically at the end of the street. Clara sprinted across the mud, diving into the alley just as the first shot shattered the saloon window, showering the boardwalk in jagged glass. Elias did not hesitate. He yanked the scarf back up, hauled his fallen hat from the mud, and drew the massive coat from his shoulder holster. He grabbed Clara's arm with a grip like a vice, his immense strength hauling her forward as he plunged deeper into the claustrophobic labyrinth of prosperity's back alleys. The hunt had instantly shifted. They were no longer the hunters delivering justice. They were prey trapped in a maze of timber and lead. Shouts erupted from every direction as Thorne's mercenaries, eager for the massive bounty placed on the scarred man's head, swarmed the streets. The night erupted into chaos. Gunfire flashed blindly in the darkness, the heavy slugs tearing through the unpainted siding of brothels and storage sheds, sending showers of lethal wooden splinters raining down upon them. Elias navigated the pitch-black, twisting corridors between the buildings with a desperate, heavy speed. His crippled leg dragged through the muck, but pure. Adrenaline-fueled survival pushed him forward. He returned fire only when necessary, his coat roaring with a deafening percussion, dropping a mercenary who rounded a corner too quickly. They burst out of an alley and directly into the gaping double doors of the town's sprawling livery stable. The cavernous interior was pitch black, filled with the pungent, overwhelming scent of wet hay, leather harnesses, and panic. 24 horses kicked and whinnied in their wooden stalls, terrified by the sudden violence echoing through the town. Elias shoved the heavy timber doors shut, dropping a thick wooden crossbar into the iron brackets. It was a temporary barrier at best. Clara knelt behind a stack of grain sacks, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She racked the lever of her Winchester, chambering around, her eyes adjusting to the slivers of moonlight piercing the gaps in the roof. Outside, the muddy street filled with the heavy thud of boots and the sharp, metallic clatter of rifle actions. They were entirely surrounded. The muffled, cruel voice of Carver cut through the din, ordering his men to surround the perimeter and prepare the kerosene lanterns. The telegraph had been sent, but the marshal was a 2-day ride away, and Thorne's men were already closing the net around the livery. How long could a battered surgeon and a desperate rancher hold off an army of hired killers in a town built on corruption? And what brutal sacrifice would the morning demand before the law finally arrived? Wood and dry hay do not merely burn, they detonate when kissed by kerosene. The livery stable transformed into a roaring, claustrophobic inferno in a matter of seconds, leaving the trapped pair with only one desperate avenue of escape. The air instantly turned to a searing, black fog that scorched the back of Clara's throat and blinded her eyes. Around them, the terrified horses shrieked, kicking their heavy hooves against the wooden stalls as the flames raced up the structural beams, devouring the dry timber with a ravenous hunger. To stay was to be reduced to ash, but to step out the front doors was to face a firing squad. Elias did not hesitate. He grabbed Clara by the heavy collar of her sheepskin coat and dragged her toward the rear of the stables. The back wall of the livery shared a structural partition with the adjacent building, the Silver King Saloon, Silas Thorne's sprawling, opulent monument to his own greed. Elias threw his massive shoulder against the aged pine boards. Once, twice, and on the third brutal impact, the timber splintered and gave way. They tumbled through the jagged breach, coughing violently, escaping the fiery tomb just as the livery's roof began to cave in behind them. They found themselves in the dark, cramped liquor storage of the saloon, surrounded by crates of imported French wine and barrel-aged whiskey. The deafening roar of the fire was somewhat muffled here, but the shouts of Thorne's mercenaries were growing louder. They were circling the block, Elias kicked open the swinging double doors of the storeroom, leading Clara out into the grand expanse of the saloon proper. The Silver King was a cathedral of frontier vice. 3 massive crystal chandeliers hung from a soaring, painted ceiling, casting a brilliant, glittering light over velvet-draped poker tables and a 50-foot bar carved from solid Honduran mahogany. The patrons and the dealers had long since fled the escalating violence in the streets, leaving the opulent room eerily abandoned. But the silence was shattered an instant later. The front batwing doors were violently kicked open, and the first wave of Thorne's men poured into the room, rifles raised. "Down!" Elias roared, his voice vibrating with the concussive force of a cannon. He lunged forward, gripping the edge of a massive, solid oak faro table. With a supreme exertion of his immense strength, he flipped the heavy piece of furniture onto its side just as a volley of rifle fire tore through the air. The heavy lead slugs chewed into the thick oak, sending lethal, jagged splinters flying over their heads. Clara hit the polished hardwood floor, scrambling behind the makeshift barricade, her ears ringing violently from the sudden, enclosed percussion of the gunfire. Behind the bar, the towering mirror of imported Belgian glass shattered into 10,000 glittering shards, raining down upon the mahogany like a deadly hail. Elias operated with the cold, terrifying precision of a seasoned combat veteran. He did not fire blindly. He crouched low behind the table, his breath steady despite the chaos, tracking the muzzle flashes reflecting off the remaining glass. He waited for the brief mechanical pause as a mercenary levered a new cartridge into his chamber. Then Elias rose. His heavy Colt revolver barked twice in rapid succession. The booming reports echoed through the grand room, and 2 men near the entrance collapsed instantly, their bodies tangling in the heavy velvet drapes. Clara did not cower. The freezing, brutal trek across Blackwood Ridge had burned the panic out of her system, leaving only a hard, focused will to survive. She rested the heavy octagonal barrel of her Winchester over the edge of the overturned table, her cheek pressed against the cold walnut stock. Through the drifting haze of sulphurous black powder smoke, she spotted a mercenary attempting to flank them by creeping along the brass rail of the sweeping mezzanine staircase. She centered the iron sights on his chest, exhaled a ragged breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked hard against her bruised shoulder. The man cried out, dropping his weapon as he tumbled backward down the carpeted stairs, crashing heavily onto the floorboards below. They were holding the line, but the sheer volume of incoming fire was tearing their sanctuary to pieces. The oak table was rapidly disintegrating under the sustained barrage, and the air was thick with flying lead and the choking, sharp scent of cordite. High above them, concealed in the shadows of the second-floor indoor balcony, Carver had finally found his vantage point. The hollow-eyed killer rested his repeater on the polished wooden railing, taking careful aim through the swirling smoke. His crosshairs bypassed the massive, scarred frame of the surgeon and settled directly on Clara's back as she reloaded her rifle. Elias saw the subtle shift in the shadows. He caught the faint, metallic glint of the rifle barrel angling downward from the balcony. He knew instantly that he could not raise his Colt in time to beat the pull of Carver's trigger. With a guttural, desperate roar, the giant abandoned the safety of the barricade. He threw his massive body forward, lunging across the open space to place himself squarely between Clara and the plunging trajectory of the bullet. The rifle cracked from the balcony. The heavy lead slug struck Elias high in the right side of his chest, just beneath the collarbone. The catastrophic impact sounded like a butcher's cleaver striking a slab of beef. The sheer kinetic force of the bullet spun the massive man around, his blood spraying in a dark, violent arc across the shattered crystals scattered on the floor. Elias crashed heavily onto his back, his breath escaping his lungs in a wet, ragged wheeze. "Elias!" Clara screamed, her voice tearing with absolute, unbridled terror. She abandoned her rifle and crawled to his side, ignoring the bullet snapping over her head. Elias was bleeding profusely, the thick crimson pooling rapidly on the polished floorboards, soaking into his heavy woolen coat. His singular blue eye was wide, staring up at the painted ceiling, his massive chest heaving with agonizing effort. Yet, even as his life bled out onto the floor, his right hand gripped his Colt. He raised the heavy iron by sheer, stubborn will, firing 3 blind shots toward the balcony to force Carver into cover, buying Clara a few precious seconds of life. Then, the relentless gunfire abruptly ceased. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ruined saloon, broken only by the crackle of the burning livery stable next door and the wet, rattling breaths of the dying surgeon. Through the haze of gun smoke, the front doors swung wide. The mercenaries parted, lowering their rifles as a figure stepped over the shattered glass and splintered wood. Silas Thorne had finally arrived to survey his bloody handiwork. Thorne was impeccably dressed, a stark, grotesque contrast to the slaughter surrounding him. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and carried a silver-tipped walking stick. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his cold, calculating eyes swept over the devastation with the mild, detached annoyance of a man observing a spilled glass of wine on a fine rug. He stopped a few paces from the overturned table, looking down at the massive, bleeding man on the floor. "I must admit, Major," Thorne said, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying easily through the quiet room. "When my men told me the beast of Blackwood Ridge had come down from his mountain, I hardly believed it. But you always were a remarkably stubborn creature. You should have burned in Petersburg. It would have saved us both a great deal of trouble." Elias spat a mouthful of blood onto the floorboards, his ruined face twisting into a terrifying, crimson-stained sneer, but he lacked the air to speak. Thorne turned his cold gaze to Clara, who knelt defensively over the surgeon, her hands trembling as she pressed against his chest wound. Thorne drew a small, beautifully engraved silver derringer from his waistcoat, cocking the hammer with a sharp, metallic click. "The deeds, Miss Vance," Thorne demanded softly, pointing the small pistol directly at her face. "You have played a very brave, very foolish game. Hand me the parchment, and I will permit you to walk out of this town. Refuse, and you will die in the dirt beside this monster, and I will simply take them from your corpse." Clara looked up into the eyes of the man who had ordered the butchery of her parents. She felt the heavy, blood-stained parchment pressed against her ribs. She looked down at Elias, who had sacrificed the last remnants of his shattered life to protect her. She tightened her jaw, her eyes burning with an unyielding, absolute hatred. "You will burn for what you've done," Clara whispered, refusing to break his gaze. Thorne sighed, a sound of genuine aristocratic disappointment. "A pity," he murmured, his finger tightening on the trigger. But the frontier is a land of sudden, violent reckonings, and the desperate plea tapped out on a brass key had crossed the miles faster than Thorne's arrogance could have ever calculated. Before the hammer of the derringer could fall, the remaining glass of the saloon's front windows blew inward with a thunderous, shattering crash. The heavy batwing doors were trampled flat beneath the iron-shod hooves of a massive, charging roan warhorse. The beast slid to a halt on the polished floorboards, snorting violently. Astride the horse sat a grim, imposing man wearing a heavy canvas duster, a tarnished silver star pinned prominently to his chest. He was flanked by 6 hardened federal deputies who poured through the doorway, leveling heavy, double-barreled repeating shotguns at Thorne's stunned mercenaries. The federal marshal had not been in Denver. He had been investigating a violent rail dispute 2 towns over, and the telegraph wire had found him waiting at the relay station. He had ridden the iron tracks straight into prosperity, guided by the smoke and the sounds of war. "Drop the iron, Thorne!" the marshal bellowed, his voice echoing like the crack of a whip. "By order of the federal government, you are under arrest." The tables had turned with a violent, breathtaking suddenness. The mercenaries, realizing they were outgunned by federal law, immediately dropped their rifles, raising their hands in surrender. Thorne stood frozen, his pristine suit suddenly looking like a shroud. the silver derringer trembling in his hand as he stared down the barrels of 6 shotguns. But as the law finally seized control of the corrupted town, Clara did not feel the sweet relief of victory. She pressed her desperately trembling hands harder against Ulysses' chest, her tears falling freely onto his ruined, blood-streaked face. The giant's breathing was growing alarmingly shallow, his milky eye rolling back toward the painted ceiling. The law had arrived to save the valley, but had it arrived too late to save the man who had traded his life for the truth? Justice on the frontier rarely arrives with the quiet, dignified strike of a wooden gavel. It announces itself with the deafening, metallic clatter of dropped rifles and the suffocating stench of burnt powder. Silas Thorne, a man who had purchased judges and governed vast territories with a fountain pen and a ledger, stared at the 6 gaping barrels of federal shotguns, his untouchable empire dissolving in the span of a single heartbeat. He let the engraved silver derringer slip from his manicured fingers. It struck the polished mahogany floorboards with a pathetic, hollow thud, a tiny sound entirely swallowed by the ringing silence of the ruined saloon. The federal marshal stepped forward, his heavy leather boots crunching over the shattered Belgian mirror glass, and clamped heavy, crude iron cuffs around Thorne's wrists. The railroad baron did not struggle, but his aristocratic features twisted into a mask of pure, venomous disbelief. He had spent his entire life insulated by wealth, entirely convinced that consequences were a burden reserved strictly for the poor. Clara did not watch the tyrant fall. Her entire world had narrowed to the massive, heavily bleeding chest beneath her desperately trembling hands. The thick, dark blood pulsed rapidly through her fingers, soaking into the knees of her trousers. Elias was suffocating, his ruined face pale and drawn tight with an agonizing lack of oxygen. His singular blue eye fluttered, the sharp focus fading into a distant, hazy stare. Would the towering protector, the man who had survived the hellfire of a Confederate artillery barrage and endured a decade of frozen isolation, finally succumb on the floor of the very town he had bled to expose? "A doctor!" Clara screamed, her voice tearing her throat, echoing off the high, painted ceiling. "Bring the physician!" The patrons and townsfolk, who had been cowering in the muddy street, began to creep back into the shattered doorway, staring in paralyzed horror at the scene. The town doctor, a small, bespectacled man carrying a worn leather satchel, hesitated at the threshold. His eyes were wide with ingrained prejudice, terrified to approach the dying beast of local folklore. Clara did not plead. She grabbed her fallen Winchester rifle, levering a fresh shell into the chamber with a vicious, metallic snap, and leveled the iron sights directly at the physician's chest. "Fix him!" Clara commanded, her tone possessing the cold, unyielding density of a mountain avalanche. "Or I will put you in the ground beside him." The doctor scrambled forward, dropping to his knees beside the towering surgeon. As he cut away the bloody, heavy wool and began to pack the catastrophic chest wound with clean gauze, the townspeople of Prosperity were forced to look closely. They did not see a monster with fangs and a heart of stone. They saw the faded, blood-stained remnants of a Union Army uniform shirt worn beneath the heavy furs. They saw a grievously wounded veteran of the Republic, a man composed of flesh and bone, who had taken a lethal bullet to shield a young woman. The myth of the Beast of Blackwood Ridge shattered right there on the saloon floor, replaced by the profound, sobering reality of a hero's sacrifice. Days bled into agonizing weeks. The federal marshal transported Silas Thorne in heavy irons to the territorial capital in Denver. There, Clara's unyielding testimony and the blood-stained property deeds secured a swift, uncompromising conviction. The scope of Thorne's atrocities was laid bare before a federal judge. He was sentenced to hang by the neck, his vast corporate holdings seized by the government, and his army of mercenaries scattered to the wind or thrown into territorial prisons. The iron grip on the valley was finally, permanently broken. In Prosperity, Elias fought a grueling battle against the darkness. The bullet had missed his heart by a fraction of an inch, but the trauma was severe. He lay in a clean, brightly lit room at the town clinic, hovering in a feverish purgatory. Clara never left his bedside. She traded the grueling, freezing survival of the high peaks for the quiet, desperate vigil of a hospital room, changing his bandages and cooling his scarred brow with damp cloths. Eventually, the harsh winter of 1878 broke. The heavy, suffocating snows finally surrendered to the warming sun. The rivers swelled with crystal meltwater, washing away the stagnant mud and the accumulated filth of prosperity. The jagged, unforgiving slopes of the Rockies transformed, blooming with vibrant, resilient wildflowers that defied the rocky soil. The thaw brought life back to the valley, and it brought Clara back to her land. With the federal government formally backing her legal claim, Clara reclaimed the Vance family ranch. The ashes of her childhood home had been washed away by the relentless spring rains. She hired honest carpenters and stonemasons from the town, men who were eager to earn a legitimate wage free from Thorne's extortion. The rhythmic, hopeful strike of hammers and the raw scent of freshly sawn pine replaced the haunting, traumatic echoes of gunfire. She worked alongside them, digging fence posts and planting new seeds in the dark, fertile earth. Her hands, once blackened by horrific frostbite, grew calloused and strong. She was rebuilding her legacy, refusing to let the cruelty of men dictate the end of her story. Yet, an undeniable emptiness lingered in the newly built timber house. Elias had survived the infection, but his recovery was agonizingly slow. When Clara had left Prosperity to begin the construction, the aging surgeon was still confined to his bed, speaking little, staring out the clinic window toward the distant, jagged spine of Blackwood Ridge. She feared the mountain would call him back, that the deep grooves of his decades-long isolation would prove stronger than the fragile bond they had forged in the fire. One late afternoon in May, as Clara painted the wide porch railing of her new home, she heard a sound that made her heart catch violently in her throat. It was the heavy, irregular crunch of boots on the gravel drive. A solid thud, followed by a scraping drag. She turned, dropping the paintbrush into the grass. Elias stood at the edge of the property line, bathed in the warm, golden sunlight of the late afternoon. He no longer wore the terrifying, heavy animal furs of an apex predator. He was dressed in a simple, clean canvas shirt, a leather vest, and sturdy denim trousers. His right arm rested securely in a dark cloth sling, a lasting testament to the bullet he had taken, and his terrible burn scars remained, forever etched into the right side of his face. But his posture had fundamentally changed. The oppressive, defensive weight he had carried for over a decade had completely evaporated. He did not look like a man preparing for an ambush. He looked like a man who had finally come home. The town of Prosperity, thoroughly purged of its venom and humbled by the truth, no longer crossed the street when he walked past. The men tipped their hats to the aging surgeon, and the children, no longer fed lies about a monster, waved from the boardwalks. He had walked out of the clinic and straight down the valley road, leaving the isolation of the high peaks behind him forever. Elias looked at Clara with his singular, piercing blue eye. For the first time since she had dragged her frozen body to his heavy timber door, the giant smiled. It was a crooked, broken expression, pulling at the scarred tissue of his cheek, but it held the profound, undeniable warmth of 1,000 hearth fires. Clara wiped her paint-stained hands on her heavy canvas apron and ran to him. She did not hesitate, throwing her arms around his broad, uninjured shoulder, pressing her face against his chest. He wrapped his massive, capable left arm around her, holding her with the gentle, protective strength of a man who had reclaimed his own soul. The frontier was a land of unspeakable cruelty and profound loss, a vast, indifferent theater where human greed and the unforgiving elements constantly conspired to break the spirit. It demanded a heavy toll from all who dared to walk its paths. Yet, standing together in the vibrant, blooming green of the valley, Clara and Elias stood as living proof that from the absolute depths of tragedy, resilience could forge something beautiful and unbroken. They had endured the absolute worst of corrupted men and frozen mountains, bleeding together for a justice the world had tried to deny them, only to discover a profound, enduring peace in the aftermath of total ruin. Thank you for watching this tale of survival, sacrifice, and redemption. If you felt the biting cold of the mountain wind and the heat of the saloon fire, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who appreciate a true, gritty Western epic. Leave a comment below with the word resilience to let me know you stood by Clara and Elias until the smoke cleared. And please, hit the hype button so this story can reach more viewers who love authentic tales of the untamed frontier.